Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. Today we're going to be going over chapter 23 of the American Pageant titled Political Paralysis in the Gilded Age from 1869 to 1896. As always, we're going to be using the 16th edition of the American Pageant. If you have an earlier or a later edition or a completely different textbook, don't worry about it, the content's going to be the same. To start off, here are the key concepts for this chapter. These are located at the beginning of every chapter in the American Pageant. I know I say this every time, but really try to match the key terms to the key concepts here because it'll really help you organize your information and it will be super helpful for you on the AP exam. Remember, the AP exam is basically just testing your ability to draw from certain eras and time periods and formulate an essay or a short answer or whatever. So if you're able to organize your key terms beforehand in terms of eras and the various sub-eras or subtopics within that era, you will be literally golden for the exam because that's basically just what it's testing. So I definitely recommend you try that. Okay, so before we talk about President Grant, let's talk about this era as a whole, the Gilded Age. This was a term used by Mark Twain to describe the late 1800s. The US underwent massive industrialization, which led to the creation of millionaires and big business. Although the era initially appeared prosperous because of the thriving economy, many poor unskilled workers suffered from low wages, long working hours, and unsanitary living conditions. So think about the word gilded. Gilded means something is pretty and beautiful on the outside, but in reality it's just dull and worthless on the inside. That's sort of what you're going to see during the Gilded Age. At first, you see a thriving economy, new industries, more jobs, but when you dig a little deeper, you realize that people are being horribly mistreated and there's a larger concentration of wealth to the top, to the business tycoons. And this will lead to a large wealth inequality that will only continue to grow from here. Okay, so now let's talk a little bit about the election of 1868. This is essentially where Grant comes into the picture. To start off, Democrats nominate Horatio Seymour, who wanted to help struggling farmers by putting more money into circulation and keeping interest rates low. Republicans, meanwhile, nominate the national Civil War hero, Union General Ulysses S. Grant, who advocated for continued military reconstruction in the South. Grant wins largely because African Americans, who now have the right to vote Republican. He's also very well known for waving the bloody shirt. In other words, reviving memories of the glorious and bloody victory of the Union in the Civil War and connecting that victory to a better government leadership under Grant. So this is another key reason why Grant wins the presidency. Keep in mind that the Gilded Age was known for immense corruption due to the lenient government policies on business, and specifically under Grant's administration. I will talk about this more in a little bit, but just keep that in mind. Some other scandals you should know about are Tweed Ring, where the boss of Tammany Hall, Boss Tweed, used bribery, graft, and fraudulent elections to scam New York taxpayers out of $200 million. So if you remember, Tammany Hall was the political machine where they would provide basic welfare services to the low-income families of New York in exchange for political support. And of course, Boss Tweed was exposed by the prominent political cartoonist Thomas Nast. You will likely see a political cartoon by Thomas Nast at some point during your APUSH career or APUSH classes, so just keep that name in mind. Another scandal you should know about is the Credit Mobilier affair in 1872. Two people create a railroad company known as Credit Mobilier and hired themselves at inflated rates to build the railroad. They also bribed two congressmen to keep quiet, who were later convicted in a trial. And overall, this is showing you how rampant corruption really was during this time, even seeping into the federal government system. So in reality, people were able to get away with a lot of stuff under Grant's administration, as we'll talk about in the next slide as well. And that is super important to make note of. Okay, so let's talk about what exactly happens during Grant's administration. For one, you have the whiskey ring, where the national treasury was robbed of millions of dollars from the revenue of excise taxes on whiskey. And when it was discovered that Grant's private secretary was one of the culprits, Grant tried to exonerate him. So early on, you're seeing lots of corruption and lots of scandals. And yet, surprisingly enough, Grant is reelected in the election of 1872. So let me explain that. The Democrats nominate Horace Greeley, who's a New York Times editor who's very famous for criticizing Democrats, which is kind of ironic. But he called for unity and no more Reconstruction. Republicans chose Grant because, despite his corruption, he was the lesser of two evils, and he was elected. And Grant's presidency following the re-election doesn't really get any better, because you have the Panic of 1873, which happened almost immediately after Grant was re-elected. It was mostly due to overpopulation in various industries and banks loaning out too much money with no return on investment. And essentially, this is really important because it distracts the nation from enforcing Reconstruction. The hard-fought civil rights that African Americans had secured are now starting to disintegrate a little bit because the federal government is focusing on other scandals and crises and whatever. So that's an important note. And this is sort of like the very, very beginning of the end of Reconstruction. And due to the panic, many African Americans who had just begun to save money lost many of their investments, which further delayed them from gaining economic independence and social equality. So remember, we talked about how many African Americans, they were unskilled workers, and they only relied on sharecropping as like a viable source of income for them. So they had just begun saving money, possibly to get an education and move up the social ladder. And now that they've lost their investments, they can't do that and they're stuck with sharecropping. One really important thing to know is following the panic, people who are in debt, also known as debtors, wanted the government to circulate more paper money because it was less valued than, quote, hard currency, in other words, gold, and would therefore be easier to pay off their debts. Creditors, or people who gave out the money, said that they wanted their money paid back in full, not in depreciated dollars. And Grant, in this case, sides with the creditors. He doesn't give a lot of paper currency out because then it would be easier for people in debt to pay back their debt. So in response to this, people in debt then turn to advocate for more silver to again increase inflation, but nothing comes of this just yet. This is going to be a continued struggle, a continued debate for the next several decades, the debate that is between soft currency and hard currency. So this is really just the beginning of it, so just keep it in mind. And finally, last important idea you need to know about under Grant's administration is patronage. Essentially, both Democrats and Republicans gave jobs to party regulars in exchange for their political support. So this is really similar to the spoils system during the Jacksonian era. If you remember, Jackson would give his political supporters positions in public office. And keep in mind, his supporters were from the West, they were often uneducated, and they were being put in positions of power. So they were unqualified, and in general, they didn't really know how to participate in a government. So this led to overall an inefficient and an ineffective government system. Stalwarts supported this idea, while half-breeds advocated for more civil service reform so that jobs were given based on merit and not on political support. And we'll see this idea is again going to be something that we're going to see throughout the era, and there will be reforms in the future, but just keep this in mind because it is definitely important to know about. Okay, so let's talk about Reconstruction and how it's kind of fading away from America's conscience, specifically for white people, because it doesn't really affect them. Reconstruction isn't really their priority, so they aren't going to really prioritize it anymore. And so this all really starts with the election of 1876, where Republicans nominate Rutherford B. Hayes from Ohio, and Democrats choose Sam Tilden, who's known for exposing corruption and is a staunch advocate for civil service reform. And so after all of the voting and the ballot counting, the results of 3 southern states are still somewhat unclear. So Sam Tilden and Rutherford B. Hayes come up with a compromise known as the Compromise of 1877, where Hayes, the Republican, would be elected president if he agreed to pull out troops from the South and give Democrats some political positions. Hayes complies, and this marks the official end of government efforts put towards enforcing Reconstruction. So as we'll see, consequently, people will start to take Reconstruction a bit more leniently, and this will detrimentally impact African Americans. And you see this with the civil rights cases of 1883. Essentially, it said that the 14th Amendment only protected against government violations of civil rights. So if you remember, the 14th Amendment said that all citizens, including former slaves, are protected equally against, or under, I should say, under the law. But now this is saying that that only applies to the government, and individuals can discriminate all they want. So this also overturned reforms that were made under the Civil Rights Act, which further undermined Reconstruction. So because of this compromise of 1877, we're starting to see how Reconstruction is going very downhill. And because of this, many African Americans were forced into sharecropping, which, remember, we discussed in the last chapter and just a couple slides ago. And this sometimes meant working under their former masters. So imagine how abusive and mistreated they must have been, even as sharecroppers, not just slaves anymore. Because although they're technically not slaves, they're probably still going to be treated like it, because there's this sort of racial superiority complex that the former slave masters had. And Reconstruction was further undermined with the Jim Crow laws. This was systematic racism at the legal level, and it was implemented in many southern states. It created poll taxes and literacy tests to make it more difficult for African Americans to vote. So essentially, just to even cast their ballot, African Americans had to take a literacy test that most Americans at the time couldn't even pass themselves, and they had to pay taxes. So think about it. As sharecroppers, they don't have that much money to spare. So voting isn't seen as a civic duty so much as it is a burden, and who wants another problem? So they're not going to vote as much, which is kind of what the South's trying to do. They want to decrease the influence that African Americans have in elections. And finally, one really important court case you need to know about is Plessy versus Ferguson in 1896. Essentially, the Supreme Court validated segregation, allowing for facilities that were, quote, separate but equal. So in other words, places can be racially segregated but must be given equal resources. Obviously, white facilities were substantially better in order to maintain some level of white supremacy, so African Americans were being poorly educated and compared to their white peers, which meant that white people would sustain some sort of level of white supremacy, and it would be easier for them to move up the social ladder, or the economic ladder, I guess. And African Americans are sort of stuck at the bottom. And this is really monumental because it's showing how even the federal government is directly reversing these Reconstruction reforms. Super important that you remember this one. Okay, so before we talk about Presidents Garfield and Arthur, let's talk a little bit about the political climate, specifically how it pertains to immigrants. You should note that racial and ethnic tensions increased as the Chinese immigrant population also increased domestically. Because they were really like labor competition for the Irish. Both of them relied on very menial labor. Both of them actually helped to build the Transcontinental Railroad. So they're kind of seen as competition to one another. So this will further increase tensions between the two. And you should note that they were poor, uneducated, and often single males who had difficulty assimilating and did dangerous menial jobs, like, for example, building the Transcontinental Railroad. People like Dennis Kearney told his Irish following to attack the Chinese, which often ended fatally. And you even see these nativist or these anti-immigrant sentiments in government policy. So for example, in the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, this banned Chinese immigration to the US, and it was the first federal law that restricted immigration on the basis of ethnicity, even though the Chinese were, again, vital in building railroads and mining. So you're going to see this nativist sentiment still lingering for decades to come, and it's important to just keep that in mind. Okay, so let's talk about the election of 1880, because this is really where Presidents Garfield and Arthur come into play. Essentially, the Republicans choose to nominate the dark horse candidate, James Garfield, who is a half-breed. Half-breeds, if you remember from the previous slide, are people who advocate for civil service reform and want to abolish patronage. However, he chooses his vice president to be Chester Arthur, who is a stalwart, meaning he wants patronage to live on, he believes in the spoils system, and just awarding your political supporters with positions of power. And this really becomes important because Garfield is assassinated by a stalwart in the hopes that Chester Arthur, who is set to become president, would give them jobs in office. However, Arthur actually becomes an advocate for civil service reform, and he passes the Pendleton Act, which I'll talk about in a bit, but this plan completely backfires on the stalwarts. So the Pendleton Act is sort of considered like the Magna Carta of civil service reform. It made mandatory campaign contributions from the federal government employees illegal and established the Civil Service Commission to ensure federal jobs were awarded based on merit. So in other words, you have to earn the job. You won't just be handed it because you support a certain political party. However, the one downside to this act is that politicians will now turn to big business for campaign contributions, and this will further strengthen ties between the government and business, and essentially this mutually beneficial relationship will create problems in the very near future. And finally, the last election you need to know about for this chapter is the election of 1884. Essentially, the Republicans nominate James Blaine, who had many political assets but was very corrupt, and Democrats chose Grover Cleveland, who had a generally good reputation, but as we'll see in the future, as in like the next slide, he had a somewhat controversial presidency. And Republicans, some of whom were disillusioned by Blaine, voted Democrat and helped Cleveland win. So let's talk about that. What exactly happened during Cleveland's presidency? Well, for one, a lot of questions arose about this new president. Would he get rid of civil service reform? Could the Democrats, the party who had created the disunity of the nation during the Civil War, be trusted? Because remember, in the years following the Civil War, it was really just Republicans who were in the presidential chair because Republicans were the ones who could be trusted, and that's what African Americans tended to vote for, and they also had a pretty large influence. So they were generally holding positions of power, but now it's a Democrat. So people are very concerned about the future. Really, the key takeaway from Cleveland's presidency is that he is known for using the laissez-faire policy, where the government used this sort of like hands-off policy to ensure big business maximized their profits, and this would in turn boost the national economy. This set a precedent of pro-business policies throughout the late 1800s, despite the growing public outcry for more government regulation. And because of this, the federal government began ignoring public pleas for reform. So kind of like, what's his name? Rob Swanson. Kind of like Rob Swanson. He's basically like the federal government. They're just ignoring whatever people are saying to them, and they're going to be very pro-business. So that's definitely an important thing to note. Let's talk more about Cleveland's philosophies, one of which is the idea that people should support the government, but the government shouldn't support the people. So this is really seen when he refused to provide aid to farmers who are financially devastated by a drought because he thought it would be counterproductive in developing the American character. So essentially he's saying, if I give you money, then you're going to be reliant on that money and you're not going to want to work. And obviously this is inherently wrong because farmers, what are they going to do about a drought? They literally have nothing else to do in that moment. And unless he wants them to die, he can't just not give them money. Like, how are they going to survive? So this is why he's very controversial, and it kind of explains why he served two non-consecutive terms as president. He was elected for 2 terms, but not consecutively. So he was elected in the election of 1884, and then 4 years went by, and then he was reelected. You should also note that Cleveland was known for establishing a lowered tariff, much to the dismay of big business, who now had foreign competition and could no longer sustain a monopoly. So remember, with high tariffs, that means that it's very difficult for foreign products to come into the nation, which means this is encouraging domestic industries to basically do whatever they want, because now that they don't have any foreign competition, people are forced to buy the product because that's literally the only product they can buy. So they can hike up the price however much they want. But now that Cleveland lowered the tariff, a bunch of foreign products can come in, and now they're going to have like legitimate competition, and they have to make an actually decent product. So Cleveland is not just upsetting farmers, he's also upsetting the rich. And because of this partisan tariff issue, Grover is replaced with William Henry Harrison, who is a Republican. But he comes back for a second term, making him the first president to serve a non-consecutive 2-term presidency, which I just mentioned before. And in terms of Harrison's presidency, you don't really need to know too much, maybe 2 things. But one of them is the $1 billion Congress. So because he had an immense amount of federal surpluses, Harrison spent lavishly on Civil War veteran pensions and government purchases of silver. He also passed the McKinley Tariff of 1890, which was the highest tariff in U.S. history and obviously favored big business. Poor farmers are deeply affected because they have to buy raw materials abroad with a steep fee, and this causes the Republican Party to lose much of its support. And this is kind of like the beginning of the end of the Republican Party being like the liberal party. Now they're going to be more conservative. And finally, last but not least, well, it is the least because this is the last slide of content, but this is the miscellaneous section because there were some things in here that I didn't really know how to categorize, but they are mentioned in the textbook and they're super important, so you definitely need to know about them. For one, you have the Populist Party, also known as the People's Party. This was created to advocate for protections of the impoverished masses against big business, specifically protections for farmers against big business because they were often discriminated against. They also wanted free and unlimited coinage of silver, a graduated income tax where the poor had lower tax rates and the rich had higher tax rates, and government ownership of railroads and the telegraph. This last one was especially controversial because the government, although they were tied closely to big business, they did not want to completely own business because they wanted them to maximize their profit. So essentially they were saying, you know what, business, do whatever you have to get all the money you need. We won't really do anything about it. And if there were to be government ownership of the railroads and the telegraph, they wouldn't be able to maximize profits because it wouldn't allow for monopolies and trusts. They also wanted a one-term presidency maximum. Remember, at this point, the two-term presidency wasn't like mandated, but it was the norm. Generally, presidents only went for 2 terms, but populists are saying that only 1 term should be allowed. They also wanted immigration restrictions because immigrants were seen as a threat to the labor competition, and they also wanted a shorter workday. And I'll definitely talk about the Populist Party in the future, but it is mentioned here briefly, and it's a very important aspect that you need to know about for this era. Another thing you should know about is the Homestead Strike of 1892. This was one of the many violent labor strikes at Andrew Carnegie's steel plant that occurred over pay cuts, and really all of these strikes helped the Populist Party to gain support, and it's a major instance of aggrieved workers rebelling against the capitalist order. And we'll talk more about Andrew Carnegie and all of these other robber barons or business tycoons in later chapters, but this strike is definitely one you need to know about. However, in terms of the populists, you should note that they weren't able to garner much support from all farmers, as racial divisions between black and white farmers still lingered, so ultimately they met with limited success in terms of achieving their goals. Speaking of black farmers, or really black people in general, you should know about the grandfather clause. This exempted voters from all poll taxes and literacy tests if they voted in the election of 1860. So in other words, this basically meant all white men are exempt. This, along with other forms of intimidation like the KKK, prevented notable black representation in elections. So black people are afraid to vote. It feels more like a burden than anything else, so obviously they're not going to want to vote. And they can't really vote because of these restrictions either way. You should also note that after Grover Cleveland is reelected in the election of 1892, 4 years after his initial presidency, there is a major economic depression with new questions surrounding greenbacks, aka paper money, and hard currency, like precious metals, gold and silver in this case. It also delayed the building of the Transcontinental Railroad, which will play a huge role in industrialization and urbanization, as we'll see in a couple chapters. But just so you know, the greenbacks versus hard currency debate is still going strong, and it's going to be a major talking point for elections in the future. And just a little FYI, some of the causes of the Depression included labor strikes, over speculation and overbuilding on land, and an agricultural depression. You're not going to be quizzed on the causes particularly of like minor depressions and panics, but it is helpful to know about when you want to provide context for a DVQ, LEQ, short answer, so it's definitely like a good thing to know. And in terms of all this soft currency, hard currency debate, you should note that all of the American silver that was circulating damaged American credit abroad as Europe began to call in loans that they had given to the US. Cleveland makes a deal with the banks to give some money, the public finds out, and they are outraged. So again, Cleveland is very controversial. And yeah, that does it for this chapter. Here are the credits for how we got everything you just saw. Thank you so much for watching. Comment below if you have any questions. Please be sure to like and subscribe, all of that. It really helps us out and lets us know that these videos were helpful for you, and it helps me make videos in the future. So yeah, see you in the next one.